Uh, okay, we talked earlier about competition in private markets. How competitive is the market for mutual funds?
I mean, asset managers in general, I think, whether it's mutual funds or ETFs or whatever the wrapper or the delivery vehicle is, um, uh, the asset management market in general, I think, is quite competitive. You can see this in. I mean, I have a paper with a co-author that looks at this in mutual funds, but you can see this in other markets as well. Um, think about the way that this business works is you create a product, you deliver that product to investors. um, the cost of entry and exit for an investor into a product is relatively low, with the exception of, taxes. Um, and if you think about the marginal cost of the producer, there's some fixed costs for me to set up a fund complex and create a fund. But then the marginal costs, especially in days now, like where the technology is really good, the marginal costs are not that high. So what does that mean? You get new entrants generate competition, and the more competition there is, I mean, I don't know anybody who doesn't like competition. You get better products at better prices, quality improvement, price improvement. What's not to like? Um, I love it. I wish there were even more electric vehicle producers, right? Because what happens? Prices fall, quality goes up. That's great.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You've got a pretty new paper that's man, it's mind blowing. This is a cool paper. How does diversification in mutual fund investors affect the performance of the funds that they invest in?
Oh, it's actually really intuitive, really, really intuitive. So suppose you're setting up a business, okay? You're setting up a business, ignore mutual funds. You're just setting up a business and you have what we call a corner client. Your corner client represents 50% of your business from your perspective, okay? That's a pretty important client, right? From your perspective, that's a big client. Okay, now suppose you have a customer who's a small client of yours. So 5%. But from their perspective, their investment in your business is 80%. So they're a small client to you. You are a big provider to them.
Yep.
Okay, so now let's go back to your business. Your business, you are worried that that client that you have that represents 50% of your revenue stream says, I don't like you anymore, I'm going elsewhere. You're going to be scared of that, right? You don't want that. So what do you want? Well, you want a diversified client base. That makes sense, right? I don't know any business that says, oh, I only want one client and it's the government. Okay, I'm just kidding about the government part, but you know what I mean, right? You don't want a concentrated client base. You want a diversified client base. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Okay, so if you have a diversified client base, if you have one client leave, no big deal, right? Not as big a deal. The other ones give you more business. That's a good thing. That's the benefit of diversification from your perspective. And now, what about that client that you had, that small fraction of you? So 5% of you, but 80% of their investment is going in there, into your business. They're sitting there worried, hey, I'm giving 80% of my capital to Cameron and Ben, but they've got this other client who's 50% of their business. If they run away, uh-oh, that's going to be bad for me. This is the mutual fund business in a nutshell. It simply says, if you are diversified across clients, different client types with different liquidity needs, then you're less likely to have what we call bank runs. where one person runs for the exit and everybody else says, oh crap, they might run for the exit. We got to go too. And that can be very harmful to investors. So there was an investment committee I used to sit on. I sat on this committee for, I don't know, many years, at least half a dozen years. And one of the things I really liked about the CIO of this IC was that every quarterly meeting, what she insisted on was that we start with a look at all the asset managers that we use for this organization and in all the individual products, the funds or ETFs or whatever, and what their flows had looked like over the last quarter, the last year, the last 3 years, the last 5 years, whatever the numbers were. And she insisted on it. I thought that was an incredibly intelligent organizational thing to do. And it made a lot of sense because you sort of sit there and go, okay, if I'm seeing a fund that's been bleeding assets, I know it's going to cost me in terms of performance, and it might cost me in terms of tax bills, at least in the mutual fund setup.
Yeah.
Part of fiduciary due diligence. You want to be able to track those things. And so the flip side of that from the fiduciary perspective is, the fund would like to have a diversified client base, and the investor would like to have the fund to have a diversified client base as well. And so, you don't want to put all your money in one basket. It's pretty simple, but it shows up in financial markets.
It is simple, but it's not. I had not spent a lot of time thinking about. I mean, it's like the bank run concept, sort of, for mutual funds. I think you mentioned that as an example.
It is.
It's fascinating. So, is there a relationship though between performance and concentration of investor base in the mutual fund space?
Sure, for sure.
Wow.
So the nice thing about mutual funds is that we can detect things with so much precision. So we measure flows on a daily basis, like every day, right? So we know what each fund's flow looks like on that day, and we know what, so there are measures of how diversified their client base is. So when they have outflows, so imagine two funds, one with a very diversified client base and one with a not diversified client base. The one with, they both have outflows, so they're both going to incur costs, right? Because securities have to be sold, and that cost is going to be borne by shareholders who remain in the fund. So if I stay in the fund, I'm going to pay one way or the other, right? And so that's why in my example earlier, or my illustration in the IC, we keep track of flows because we don't want to pay those costs. But all else equal, if you give me two funds, one that has a more diversified client base and one that has a less diversified client base, I want the one with the more diversified client base because I pay less. I still pay, but I pay less.
So how do you find that fund with a more diversified investor base?
Yeah, so I mean, we use a bunch of different proxies for it. So one proxy is you can look at this is getting nerdy and technical, but the covariance of flows across share classes, right? Funds will have like half a dozen share classes: retirement class A, retirement class B, retail, advisor, blah, blah, blah. So you can look at the covariance of flows across those. That's sort of the simplest way to do it. And that tells you. Think about 2008, right? If you're in 2008 and all your clients head for the exit, or COVID, right? All your clients head for the exit, that's not what you want. You want some patient clients to stay there to offset. And you also want some clients to say, you know what, all of you are heading for the exit. I think expected returns are high. I'm gonna, allocate more capital. That's what you want.
Yeah, so that paper, like I mentioned when we started talking about it, I found it to be just mind blowing because it's not a concept that I thought about in the context of mutual funds, but like you said earlier, it makes so much intuitive sense once you explain it.
It's so simple.
Yeah. But not easy to have been the first one to really think about it. So that's why it's a cool paper. Uh, how well have actively managed global equity mutual funds performed for retail investors?
A lot depends on what your benchmark is. So, and the benchmark is really, so there are two ways to think about a benchmark, right? One way to think about a benchmark is sort of the way that the investment community thinks about a benchmark, which might be like ACWI or whatever. Pick a benchmark that way. I think a better way to think about a benchmark from the downstream investor's perspective is what financial objectives were you trying to meet, and were you able to meet those financial objectives? So what do active global equity funds do? They invest around the world. Will they give you the global equity premium? Depending on how they are managed, how concentrated they are, how they handle costs, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them will, some of them won't. In general, the more active they are, the more costly it is for them to implement their approaches. In general, not for every single one. And those costs add up. So again, I think of a continuum of less active to most active, as opposed to totally passive, which doesn't really even exist. And as you move along that scale, you hope that expected returns rise and that costs don't rise commensurate with expected returns. Unfortunately, they do. So it's a tough gig. It's not going to be easy, but that's again where the implementation comes in.
And what does this suggest about the efficiency of markets outside the US?
Yeah, so this is something often we hear from investors often, right? That the argument, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, where somebody says, well, we believe that US markets are really, really efficient, but emerging markets are not, or markets outside the US are not. And so we're gonna use active management there and not active management or passive management here. And my response is, well, you're really using active management everywhere. It's just a matter of degree. And now you tell me you have a prior that, let's say, emerging markets are less efficient than US markets, but you show me the evidence that that's the case. And when you ask for evidence, you don't get it. And that's the issue. So it's really hard to tell whether emerging markets, for example, are less efficient than US markets. I can't tell. I mean, and I think that if I asked many of my esteemed colleagues in academia, they would probably tell you, at least those who think about these sorts of things, they would tell you the same thing. It's really hard to tell. It's or in a Bayesian sense, it's a very diffuse prior. Like I can't update this.
That's a very nerdy answer. I love it. Okay, we got two more questions for you, Sunil. You've worked with firms like Dimensional, you mentioned, for many years, and now with Avantis. How important do you think it is for financial economists to spend time with practitioners?
So back when I was young and I didn't have this much gray hair, I remember reading a little piece of writing by Fisher Black, who I think it was in some sort of practitioner journal, maybe a financial analyst journal or journal of portfolio management, something like that, in which he basically made the case that every self-respecting economist, financial economist, should spend some time in industry. And the case was the following. It says, if you're an academic, you're interested in prices. Where do prices come from? Prices come from agents trading. They come from trading, they don't magically appear. There's no such thing as a Walrasian auctioneer. So they come from real trading. And so if you want to understand prices, you should spend some time and figure out where prices really come from with industry. And then he flipped the argument around the other way and said, okay, if you're a practitioner, you're watching markets clear every single day. You're watching trading, behavior, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes you are so into the details that you miss the structural aspect of what should be rather than what is. And because you miss that structural aspect, it's worth your while to occasionally walk over to your local university or wherever and attend a seminar or two and learn to think how financial economists think about this because they think about it in a structural way. So from my perspective, I think it's incredibly important that, and I'm fortunate. I thank many people for the fact that I've been able to do this over the last 3 decades or so. My first engagement came with, I don't know if you guys know, but Ted Aronson's original firm, Aronson, Johnson and Ortiz. Ted Aronson, I think, is still the head of the CFA, maybe. One of the original value investors. I think it's incredibly important for academics to spend time in industry and vice versa. You learn a lot. And this plethora of research that we have that says, oh, here's another signal, and here are some other expected returns that you can, or an alpha that you can generate. A lot of that would go away when you realize, it doesn't work that way. It's not how prices were formed.